the sun is not just touching the outside of your body and the skin, it's actually having a direct effect on the inside at the mitochondrial level. Here's the good news, is that even if you go outside with a couple of layers, even 3 or 4 layers of clothing, you are still going to get more infrared light in that scenario because it's able to penetrate through clothes. With cloud cover, you would think that that would drop off tremendously. It actually doesn't seem to when you're looking through the film at infrared light. There is a little bit of a drop off, but it's still many, many times more than you would get if you stayed inside. There was a very strong link between sunlight exposure and influenza diagnosis. In fact, they said that sunlight was strongly protective against getting influenza. As soon as they looked at the amount of time that people spent outside, as time went up, the mortality rates dropped significantly. Looking at cancer and skin cancer, and they realized that what they've been saying before, where, avoid the sun at all costs, is not correct, that they have to rethink it, and that they do acknowledge that there are benefits to sunlight. This is how strong this evidence is.
Welcome to Sunlight Matters, the podcast that reconnects us with the sun. Join us as we explore the power and influence of our star, the force at the heart of everything. Each episode, we speak with leading experts to uncover the ways sunlight shapes our world.
Welcome to this very special episode of Sunlight Matters, and we are joined by the incredible Roger Seheult. Welcome, Roger. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're going to be digging into some practical advice for people to help them survive winter. The days are getting shorter, the temperature's going down, and I can already feel my energy levels sort of starting to drop off. And I, for one, dread winter because I get sad and so any help you can give in terms of tips, ideas, thoughts, anything backed up by the research that you've been looking out for would be fantastic. I'm also joined by Georg as well, who's come to provide his wisdom and ask questions as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think for those that, there's people in the audience that already know that sunlight is very beneficial and infrared light particularly. There's others that may be joining us that don't understand why we're talking about this subject. And I think it's good just to maybe take 2 minutes just to sort of review the science in the last literally 5 years of where we've come from. We used to think that getting outside in the sun was just for the benefit of vitamin D. And certainly vitamin D has benefit. It comes from ultraviolet light. But what we're finding out now is that there is a portion, actually a very large portion of sunlight in the infrared spectrum. The majority of the photons from the sun are in this section, and they are able to penetrate deeply into the body and even have been found to have this light on the other side of the body. So Glenn Jeffrey's work recently published this year was able to detect infrared light coming through the body. So what that means is that when you go out into the sun, that the sun is not just touching the outside of your body and the skin, it's actually having a direct effect on the inside, and specifically we believe at the mitochondrial level, which is the powerhouse of the cell. And what he showed in that study was that it improves the very aspect of the cell that we know gets worse as we age. So this is really important. Number of research articles that have come out. These are, yes, epidemiological studies that are out there, but we're talking randomized, placebo-controlled in a case of a paper that we're going to talk about shortly here, a triple-blinded study that shows that infrared light, the very type of light that we're not getting inside the homes, the very type of light that we don't get from LED bulbs, the very type of light that is plentiful in the sun, but we try to avoid it because of technology. This is the very type of light that in randomized placebo-controlled trials in a number of patients have actually not only reduced COVID-19 hospitalization by 4 days out of 12, but has just recently been shown in an intensive care unit in 60 patients in a randomized fashion, was able to cut about 30% off of their length of stay just by giving them about 10 to 15 minutes of this during the day. So the point of all of this is that we now know very clearly scientifically that there are benefits of the sun. There are a number of societies, even in Australia, that are looking at cancer and skin cancer, and they realize that what they've been saying before, where avoid the sun at all costs, is not correct. That they have to rethink it, and that they do acknowledge that there are benefits to sunlight. This is how strong this evidence is. So here we are in October. The days are getting shorter, and we know from the data that this is the time of year where hospitalizations go up, deaths from cardiac disease, lung disease, kidney disease, all sorts of diseases all go up all at the same time, a peak about 1 to 3 weeks after the shortest day of the year. And the question really comes down to what can we do right now to avoid being part of that statistic? Is that basically what the question is?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think it's like digging straight into all-cause mortality. It goes up in wintertime, and it goes up in wintertime in the northern hemisphere and up in wintertime in the southern hemisphere. Now, I think the prevailing wisdom has been that that's because everybody's inside and they're sharing germs more rather than being outside more. But I think what the evidence is starting to point to is there's something else which is going on, which is indoor lifestyle means that, as you were just saying, Roger, we're more and more starved of infrared light, which means that the way we function is suboptimal in wintertime. Isn't that
Absolutely. And to really put a nail in the coffin of that idea that it's when we're inside because it's cold and viruses are floating around, Kennedy School at Harvard Kennedy School did a study and published this in 2020 where they looked at influenza particularly, which is very seasonal as we know. And there was something very interesting that happened in 2009. It's when we had the H1N1 pandemic. What was interesting about that year with the flu season is that it came very early. It actually came in June and July. And so they were able to decouple that whole issue of temperature, of being inside, because obviously this came in June and July. That's not when people are generally inside, trying to keep out from the cold. They're inside for other reasons, but they're also outside a lot more. And even in that study, they were able to look at solar radiation data, and they were able to look at the CDC data on where the hotspots were in the United States and also in New York specifically. And they came to the conclusion that there was a very strong link between sunlight exposure and influenza diagnosis. In fact, they said that that sunlight was strongly protective against getting influenza. So I'm convinced.
Wow.
and so I mean it then makes me sort of think that as we're getting into wintertime, we all need to do more to kind of optimize exposure to infrared and potentially UV. So, I mean, the obvious thing to say is, everybody needs to get outside more. Now, uh, we had a look at some data, I think, last week, which showed that sort of measure people using Apple Watches measuring sort of daylight exposure, that in winter, people in America are getting something like 20 to 30 minutes of outside time a day, which, I think is very short, isn't it?
It is very short, and there was a graph that I recently uploaded that showed the amount of sunlight exposure versus the amount of deaths, and it correlated. It was perfect. I mean, it literally, as one went up, so did so the other one went down. It was an
Right.
inverse relationship. So, if you look at Glenn Jeffrey's work, Bob Fosbury's work, he'll look at the mitochondria and he'll say that it takes about 15 to 20 minutes of sun exposure to get the mitochondria into a state that it's in. That's full on, uninterrupted. And so if people are spending a total of 20 minutes out in the sun, you can be sure that that's mostly not, uninterrupted. There's probably a threshold there where it starts to kick in. So I would say, if you're getting a maximum of just 20 minutes total per day, that's obviously not enough. Now,
Roger.
there's another study that looked at it epidemiologically, and this was a part of the Adventist Health Study too, where they looked at longevity and how much time they spent out in the sun. And what they found was that there was a J curve type of relationship, that as soon as they looked at the amount of time that people spent outside, that at the beginning, as time went up, the mortality rates dropped significantly. And then it went down to the lowest mortality was associated with about 2 hours a day. And then after that, increasing time in the sun, the effect stopped and started to actually come back up a little bit. Obviously, we can't prove causation by the way that study was conducted, but if you look at the people in that study, in that cohort that had the longest survival benefits, it was people who were outside for 2 hours a day.
Roger, when you talk about the like being outside, even in winter, are you talking about direct sun exposure? Do you need to see the sun? Or is it like okay if it's behind clouds, or even like if you're, let's say, in the shade of a building, is that still enough of indirect sunlight to nurture your cells?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I people always accuse me, well, that's easy for you to say. You live in Southern California. And we do get quite a lot of sun days, but we also get some cloud cover. I live up about a mile up. We get snow, we get precipitation. And one of the things I was able to do in the last month is get a film that you can actually put over your smartphone camera. And yeah, you can use a spectrometer and actually measure infrared with numbers. I just think it's so much more cool to actually take photographs and upload them so people can actually see for themselves that green leaves and things of that nature reflect light. So, I know we're going into the wintertime and I'm going to be taking some photographs to see how that actually looks. But in the summertime, we actually had some rain and some cloud cover, and I was fortunate enough to be able to take some photographs when that happened, when the sun was going in and out. You would be very surprised how much difference there is between being inside, being outside with cloud cover, and then being outside without cloud cover. And what I'm trying to say is, if I could put it into sort of a way of describing it, outside without cloud cover, obviously the very brightest sun, 100,000 lux, very bright. With cloud cover, you would think that that would drop off tremendously. It actually doesn't seem to when you're looking through the filter, through the film at infrared light. There is a little bit of a drop off, but it's still many, many times more than you would get if you stayed inside. There's another photograph that I took where I'm inside my home. I've got a window with one of the panes open. So there's really three things that you're looking at. You're looking about at the amount of infrared light that's in the home during the day, and you think you're getting plenty of light when you're doing that, and you're actually not. And then there's part of the photograph where you're looking through the window, and so these windows that we are now supposed to be putting into our homes, especially here in California, are what we call low E glass. They specifically reflect back outside the infrared light, so it doesn't come inside, heat up your home, and you have to pay a lot of money to run the air conditioner. And so you could see that there was very diminished outside. It didn't look very bright. And then when I opened the window on the right hand side, you could see a tremendous amount of red light, which is basically a surrogate with this film of infrared light coming through the window and bathing. And you can clearly see that picture was worth 1,000 words. You could clearly see that even on a cloudy day, you were much better to go outside to get that type of light. Now, I think you alluded to this question, Georg, when you talk about going outside and having your skin exposed. So in the wintertime, it's cold. Who wants to go outside and be exposed? You're going to get hypothermic. It's going to be very uncomfortable, even for 15 or 20 minutes, unless you're, crazy enough to be in the polar bear club or something like that. Here's the good news is that even if you go outside with a couple of layers, even 3 or 4 layers of clothing, you are still going to get more infrared light in that scenario because it's able to penetrate through clothes than you would if you were inside your home, because it cannot penetrate through walls, can't penetrate through your roof. So that is the calculus there in terms of the benefits, even in the wintertime, of getting outside into the sunshine, even if in the shade, there's plenty of infrared light there.
So that's what, like, thank you very much for elaborating it, and I think that's a really crucial information for people that the infrared penetrates through clothes. But what I still want to get your professional confirmation, like if I'm in the city, which I do, and if I go outside in the winter months, the sun is pretty flat on the sky, there's a lot of shade by buildings. Is the indirect illumination, like the scattering from the infrared through the atmosphere, through buildings, like facades, for example, also still enough to charge up my cells, or should I really try to get at least towards the sun, even if it's behind clouds?
Yes, you should. Even if it's behind clouds, you definitely want to get outside and into the sunlight. A couple of things there. People need to understand that when you're living in the city, it's difficult to get enough sunlight for a number of reasons. Number one, the buildings can create a huge shadow, and you really need to seek out where you are. I mean, I remember visiting large cities. One in particular I remember is Toronto, which has a lot of tall skyscrapers downtown. We were actually staying at a hotel downtown, walking those streets. And it's only certain times of the day when the sun is aligned with those parallel streets that you will get the street illuminated in that type of sunlight. And obviously, when you're in the wintertime, the sun is going to be very low. And this is where you have issues with, after precipitation and rain, you can get ice that may melt and you can get black ice. So when you are living in a city with tall buildings, the issue is going to be getting that sunlight and figure out where that sunlight is going to be because of the tall shadows. The other issue that many people have with the cities, depending on how the city is built, is the issue with trees. So we've just described that this infrared light, which is very beneficial, is highly reflected from green trees and grass. And so if you're lucky enough to have a city like New York where you have Central Park, that might be a good thing, especially in the wintertime where you may have some evergreen trees and things of that nature. Obviously, in the wintertime, a lot of the leaves fall. You don't get the benefits of that. But if you're living in an area where even in the wintertime, there is a lot of alpine trees and evergreen trees, these type of trees also are highly reflective of infrared light. The
They
other benefit
basically
with
act
Central
like an
Park, you go ahead.
they basically act like an amplifier. So if you're below them or close to them, they act like an infrared amplifier, and it's even better than being just without the
Correct.
tree. Okay, cool.
Absolutely. The other aspect that I would bring up real quickly as well is many people believe that when the sun is low in the sky, it's impossible to get infrared light that's well enough. And I would just again reiterate that infrared light, the property of infrared light, is that it's able to penetrate very easily. And so yes, for ultraviolet radiation and vitamin D, when the sun is low at that level of the sky, it's very difficult for ultraviolet light to penetrate because it's a short wavelength, not able to penetrate very easily through the oblique atmosphere. Infrared light does not have that issue, and I can prove it to you as when in the wintertime you have snow on the ground and the sun comes up, it does melt the snow. That specifically is infrared light that is melting that snow. It's causing a heat transfer that is even at low temperatures can melt that snow. I once saw this very easily when the sun was going down. My roof was dripping because the sun was on it, and as soon as the sun went down, even though the temperature didn't change, the dripping immediately stopped as soon as the sun went down. This is actually a problem for people who have black ice, right? So what happens during the day? The snow falls, the sun melts, and then it refreezes at night. The next morning, you have accidents because there's black ice on the road. That black ice comes from melted snow. The melted snow comes from the sun.
It's very interesting. So I think, in terms of sort of wrapping this bit up, like getting outside sounds like something that we have to do and we have to do more of. I think a long time ago we had a small exchange. You may or may not remember it, but we had a small exchange on X about getting a dog. I mean, I think everybody, if they should get a dog, to be honest. My dogs have just heard me and now barking in the
I
garden.
hear it. I hear it. They agree.
But I certainly found that having a dog means that I've got much more motivation for getting outside, and it's they've become my sort of sun buddies, to be honest with you, over the summer. And now when I'm thinking about the winter, I'm thinking about walks we can do, which are going to be great in terms of optimizing. Like we've had a lovely day here, like optimizing the sun that you get. So
Yeah. And if you do live in the city, I was just going to say it's good to plan out your walk where you're going to have the ability to actually be in the sun. And Georg, I know that you've got an app that you're looking at too that you've developed where you're able to actually figure out where that sun is going to be so you can be more efficient. I think that's a great idea.
Exactly. I mean, also what we talked before, like the issue in the cities. This was the original reason I came up with this, because I had these 2 weeks in Vienna some 14 years ago where I just couldn't see the sun in the sky for 2 weeks, and then I was like, okay, at least in the lunch break when the sun is at the highest position, you have the best chance to catch some. But then you need an application that shows you among the three-dimensional buildings where you can even find these spots. So exactly right.
Yeah, and of course on on satellite maps you can also see where the trees are, and you can also put that into it as well. So you can actually map out the best trip to maximize the time that you're going to put into this and actually get the most amount of benefit in terms of infrared light.
It's very interesting. I think if the other side of this is, and you mentioned about LED lighting as well, is if you're inside and all your lighting is LED, then you're not getting anything in terms of infrared. So, there is a simple thing which I talked to Glenn and Bob about just swapping out LED lights for incandescent bulbs, old incandescent bulbs. And incandescent bulbs actually give you quite a good dose of infrared.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a debate I saw going back and forth on X, about whether or not the amount of infrared light coming from an incandescent light bulb would be enough to have any sort of clinical outcomes. And of course, the topic that you just described, which is switching out a LED bulb, a commercial LED bulb, which has no infrared light in it at all. Just as a note to those watching, it is possible to make LED bulbs that have infrared in it, and we could talk about that clinically in a clinical setting. But I know you're talking about commercial LEDs that are sold, that are required to be in homes so that they don't use up excess energy, creating quote wasted light in the infrared spectrum. But Glenn Jeffrey has a paper right now in review where he actually ran in a randomized fashion, put 60-watt incandescent bulbs, not replacing LEDs, but just adding them to that environment. So if people are concerned about that and they've got, LED bulbs in their ceiling that are not screw in, that they can't replace with an incandescent without, having a huge contract cost to go in there and replace those out, and they want to know what can they do. First of all, I would say the best thing to do is to get outside. Okay.
Yeah.
But if they're working in that environment, they want to make that environment healthier. Um, Paper in review right now, Glenn Jeffrey being looked at, where they randomly put 60-watt incandescent light bulbs into those work environments. And he was able to show that the mitochondria, specifically in the retina, revved up enough to to produce enough energy that the color blindness in the proton and the tritan, those are color blindness thresholds, were actually dropped statistically significantly. So what's interesting about that is that it was very robust. It worked very well in both types of color blindness. Glenn Jeffrey is a professor of ophthalmology at UCL. This is how he assesses mitochondrial function in the tissue of the body that has the highest mitochondria. And this is a regular work environment, unstructured, uncontrolled in a sense, that is in an everyday working environment. He showed very clearly in this office building at UCL that the windows on the structure were very efficient at blocking infrared light. He took a photograph inside the building. It was pitch black, except for the light that was coming through the open door. He took another photograph with all the LED lights on in the infrared spectrum, and it was pitch black. There was no light. So I think that basically that study has answered the question, at least as far as I'm concerned. Can incandescent light bulbs inside the home, just one added to an LED environment, cause enough of a change in the human body to actually cause a end organ difference? And the answer is yes.
It's incredible how finely tuned our bodies are it turns out, to things like infrared. And I think, it's the more I've kind of listened to people like Glenn and you and some of the others talk about it, the more miraculous I think that you sort of realize that the human body is. And I think one area that I'm just like confused by is how this was overlooked for so long, that we're in the UK, I guess in Europe, in the US, we're heading for this sort of low energy future, but nobody at any stage has gone, maybe incandescent bulbs were doing something else. And by the way, I mean, I was talking to an architect friend who, he was delighted when I told him this news, because he's like, well, the light from an incandescent bulb is so much nicer. And I know that because I've sort of replaced all my bulbs, and I'm like, I feel so much more relaxed just sort of looking at them. I've got two LEDs sort of facing off to me, and I can sort of feel so. But he was saying, what they give off warmth as well. You know, that infrared is warmth, and actually ambient warmth in homes is no bad thing in winter as well, you know. So anyway, it's a really interesting topic, and um, so people starting to think about putting incandescent bulbs in. And I know Bob Fosbury said, like, and Glenn said, the cheapest thing to do is just get an angle poise lamp and get, you know, an incandescent bulb, put it in your room, and that will probably be enough to kind of keep you going. So then we touched on it with the is ultraviolet and vitamin D. You know, I think one of the things that we do see is people's vitamin D levels dropping off over winter, because we're not getting, like, even if you're outside, you're not going to get the levels of UV that you do in the summer. Is there things that people can do to kind of food they can eat, or supplementation, or you know, just sunbeds, or you know, is there stuff people can do to kind of really
Or I wanna add, maybe, is it maybe just the way it is? Like, if you live in the, like, further northern hemisphere, and you just need to shift your lifestyle, like, not winter hibernation, but maybe just be also in acceptance that winter is just a different time of the year where you maybe have a different life.
Yeah, it's possible. So we've talked about infrared light. Let me just finish that topic off. There's for those of you that can do hydrocarbon fires in your fireplace,
right?
that's a source of infrared light as well. And obviously that's very common in the wintertime. So that may be help mitigating that. So something that we used to do culturally. Society used to have fires. That's how we would warm ourselves, even through a glass that infrared light's going to penetrate through there. So but ultraviolet, yeah. So that's, interestingly, Bob Fosbury has some data that even though the sun itself may be too low in the sky during the wintertime to give off enough ultraviolet, there is some evidence that the scattering of ultraviolet light into the sky may be enough to give some ultraviolet. But nevertheless, the point is that if you look at human beings in an epidemiological way, we have less vitamin D in the wintertime than we do in the summertime. And so one of the ways of supplementing that is through diet, taking supplements. Another way of doing it is to get into tanning beds. So the problem I see with tanning beds is that you're getting just ultraviolet light generally. I mean, there are tanning beds that can do both, but generally the purpose of tanning beds is to give ultraviolet radiation, which stimulates melanocytes, which gives you a tan. And it's also the ultraviolet light that makes vitamin D. The issue with that is that there's been a lot of associations of skin cancer with that type of behavior. So I'm not sure I can really wholeheartedly, full-throatedly recommend doing tanning beds to get your vitamin D. It may be safer to supplement with vitamin D. So talking about vitamin D supplementation, there's two forms of vitamin D. There's vitamin D3 and there's vitamin D2. The other name for vitamin D3 is co-calciferol, and that co in there is the same co that we see in cholesterol. And cholesterol is only seen in animals. It's not seen in plants. And obviously, since we are an animal, the skin takes cholesterol, a cholesterol derivative, and using the high energy photons of ultraviolet B radiation is able to actually break double bonds and convert it into vitamin D in our skin. So that's vitamin D3 in our skin that we can make. You can also supplement with vitamin D3. It has to come from an animal, generally speaking. And I would say 90% of the vitamin D3 on the market is coming from lanolin, which is a wax that is produced with sheep's wool that they process when they harvest the sheep's wool, and then they through some chemical reactions and ultraviolet light they can make a vitamin D3 that you can buy in a capsule. Vitamin D2, on the other hand, is not co-calciferol, but ergocalciferol, which is a plant-based steroid or hormone. That is a lot of that you can get that in shiitake mushrooms, for instance.
Okay.
You grow shiitake mushrooms and put them out into the sun. They will make vitamin D2 in various amounts depending on how long you leave it out in the sun. And you can grind that up, put it into a capsule, and take that. That's vegan. It doesn't require any animal products. There's also some nutritional benefits in the mushroom itself that you can get from that as well. Uh, Interestingly, the question is vitamin D2, vitamin D3, what are the differences between those two? So they are structurally different. They have a lot of overlap in terms of their effects, vitamin D pathways. It takes usually more vitamin D2 to get vitamin D levels up. And what's interesting, though, as they do have some overlap, there are some things that vitamin D3 will do to the human body that vitamin D2 cannot do, and vice versa. One of the things, for instance, specifically is vitamin D3 does seem to have some effect on interferon, which is a powerful substance in the innate immune system. Vitamin D2 doesn't, but there are some genes that vitamin D2 can affect that vitamin D3 doesn't. And I'm wondering, since typically one is created in the skin and the other one is a dietary, I'm my hypothesis, I don't have much proof to this, is I wonder whether or not we need both.
Wow, this is the first time I'm hearing this. That's really, really interesting. So you would supplement both, or would you share
You
what
know,
you're
it's
doing?
I haven't seen a lot of data. They're usually treated pretty much the same in the literature. They'll say vitamin D2 slash vitamin D3 when they're looking at studies and meta-analysis. But there are some very detailed studies where they've actually looked at the vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 pathways, and there are some genes that one will hit and the other will not, vice versa. I would say the vast majority of the genes and things that they activate, there is a large overlap, and that's why they're sort of treated the same. But there are some very fine, distinct differences, and they're interesting. They do behave a little bit differently.
And again, like the body is synthesizing which variant with sun exposure? Both
Vitamin
or?
D3 is the one that is exposed, is the one that is produced in the skin from sun exposure.
Okay.
Vitamin D2 is what is produced in the mushrooms when they get when they get ultraviolet B exposure.
So D2 is not in the human body from sun exposure. It's not created through any sun exposure in the human body per se.
Correct. It's only taken in by oral ingestion. Now, there is a D3 that is produced by algae. Uh, Algae is not an animal. I guess it's a plant in a sense. So that's kind of a little bit of an exception there. You can get vitamin D3 produced in algae, um, and most of that I believe is sourced from the ocean. When you do that, um, I'd have to look more into that about microplastics and things of that nature. There's also the potential of microplastics in mushrooms, although I haven't seen the data on that.
Yeah,
So
that's pretty
these
much
are some of the
everywhere
things you
by
have to think
this
about
point.
with supplementing.
Okay.
Right. Well, it's good. I mean, I think, like, I mean, it's interesting what you said about, like, what Bob Fosbury had said about, like, even with when you don't have direct sun, you know, if you've got a blue sky day, get outside because you know you will be getting some UV from that through scattering. But I think there's always
He
going
has
to
some
be,
data. Yes.
yeah. So I think that's like the sort of most basic thing that you can do. But I've always been slightly confused about supplementation around vitamin D, and I think, you know, it's great to kind of hear your thoughts. And I mean, as you're talking, it kind of almost seems obvious that you probably would need both, and they're doing slightly different things. But you know, once again, we're sort of in a realm where we're kind of flying against not perceived wisdom, but the way that things have been kind of set up, aren't we?
You know, you had asked the question before about sunlight and why didn't we realize this before? The answer to that, if I could try to make an attempt at a stab of that, is we actually did know about this before. Knew about 100 years ago, and you know that too. It's just it's not in our consciousness anymore because it's so many generations back. But if you look at the old photographs and you look at the sanitariums and you read people like Florence Nightingale and many other health reformers that were in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they knew clearly that there was no question in their mind. It was almost a foregone conclusion that sunlight, fresh air were very good for people. And what happened, I believe, is it wasn't a bad thing in and of itself. We discovered penicillin. We discovered medications. We discovered things through randomized controlled trials. And I believe that that we sort of took for granted some of the things that we knew worked. And and it's what we did was something that I think is very pervasive in society at all times. And that is, instead of going into a understanding with an and, we tried to do medical reductionism and go to the or. So in other words, the argument wasn't sunlight and fresh air and, hey, let's implement some of this new technology in the form of medications and randomized controlled trials and penicillin. It was, hey, we have a new way of treating things. We're going to do this instead of sunlight and fresh air. And we'll be able to build bigger hospitals and put more patient rooms in there so we can treat more patients, and they won't have to have, all this space and sunlight, and we can architecturally actually be able to treat more people. And I think there was sort of a bottom line there. But what they did, they may not have realized this. What they did when they did that was they made healthcare dependent on a supply chain. And when you do that, when you make, instead of going to an and type of situation, so sunlight, fresh air, all of those things that we were doing, 100 years ago, and you add to it all of these other things, you can still fall back on a backstop of, if the supply chain crumbles, you still have fresh air, sunlight, and all these things that we know how to implement. What I believe, unfortunately, what happened, maybe unconsciously, maybe over decades, is we abandoned the knowledge of what we used to be doing in hospitals, sanitariums, and things of that nature, because we had to. And we said, hey, we've got this new technology. We have this new way of doing this. And we didn't think about pandemics. We didn't think about supply chains. We didn't think about all of the things right now that are plaguing our world in terms of how do we get enough medications to enough people and get past, international disruptions in supply chains and natural disasters. Because if that were to happen, because we have made this decision of an or instead of an and, we've completely put all of our eggs in that basket of pharmacological distribution. Now what happens is, if we have a supply chain disruption and we have need, we have nothing. And then how hard is it now to go back and say, well, this is something that we used to do, but nobody's trained on that. Nobody even understands that that's even an option. And I think that's where we are right now.
It's really interesting because as this sort of review, going back to you're totally right. I mean, I hadn't thought of it. Like, we've got to retrain ourselves. And I guess one of the ironies of COVID, because, I mean, as an ICU doctor, you'll know this better than anybody, but if people were outside in the sun, their chances of survival went up dramatically. But one of the ironies is it pushed people inside. So we have whole cohorts of children and teenagers who they forgot how to go outside and play, basically, and do all of these things. And it's almost imperative that we start unlearning all of this stuff. So, when I was growing up, I mean, I grew up in the tropics, but, I'd go to church on a Sunday, would have Sunday lunch, and then my parents would always say, right, time for a walk. And I would sort of amble off behind them and, sort of like, why are they doing this? But that was the way things were done. That was, traditional, wasn't it? But it was
Yeah,
good, wasn't it? Because at
it
least
was.
for that one day, you were kind of outside for a few hours, But, going back a few years, we all spent a lot more time outside anyway. But anyway, I just sort of wondered about your thoughts around, like, what happened with COVID in terms of pushing people inside.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we know, we've got data. There's actually data that shows that the time spent outside the home had been decreasing on a scale, a gradual scale. And then when the pandemic hit, that thing just fell off the face of the planet, just dropped dramatically. And then after the pandemic ended, it did not rebound. In fact, it came up just slightly and is now continuing to fall down even further. And what happened? This is something that we see all the time in psychology, is we learned new pathways. We learn new
Right.
behaviors to prevent us or to allow us to stay inside the home. Things that used to get us outside the home, that like shopping, like meeting people, all of these things. We learn new ways of getting around that, and now we've learned those pathways. We're not going to unlearn them, and now we have even less need to go outside.
And the side effect is that those new pathways involve like screen-based dopamine addiction, and people are just sticking to the screens more. I mean, I think this is something we can really observe on ourselves as well. It's really wild. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really because I think what's happened is convenience. With the pathway is convenience. Like, because Amazon can deliver, and every day we have a queue of people delivering stuff to us. Because Amazon can deliver, we're not going to the shops, and because we can get like groceries delivered, we're not going to the soup. So all of these things that we used to do mean that we're kind of spending more and more time inside, as you say, from a kind of convenience point of view. So that what you've got to do, and I guess this is part of this podcast, is if people want to feel better in winter, they have to retrain their pathways. And one of the simple pathway things to do is to get outside more. So like even if it's raining and cloudy and miserable, you're going to get, like as you were describing, that dose of infrared that your body kind of craves. So and I think it's fascinating that's a conclusion. That's a no cost solution to this whole thing. Um,
Yeah.
so there's something else that I've been pondering quite a lot, which is saunas. So I'm a huge fan of saunas. Georg and I,
We do business in the
we
sauna.
do business. We think the sauna is the new golf course, to be honest with you. So
Well,
and
I think there's an old story of some dispute between the Russians and the Finns, and they settled it naked in a Finnish sauna.
well, there you go, right? There
There's
you
something
go.
about when the general takes off the uniform, he doesn't have all the badges and stuff, and you just have a one-on-one conversation and settle the issue.
I
But
think that's what we need
it's
right now.
interesting. Like if you see where saunas are kind of distributed, they tend to be like northern hemisphere. Something's gone on that sort of heat treatment in sort of extreme heat treatment in winter seems to have remedied something. So have you got any clues as to what's happening to the body in the sauna?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at the Swedes, very famous study, 2016, sunlight exposure in women, 30,000 women, was associated with an all-cause reduction, not only in all-cause mortality, but cardiovascular, non-cardiovascular, cancer, non-cancer mortality. In fact, the magnitude was so high that women who went outside avidly, got sunlight, and smoked had the same mortality as those women that avoided the sun and didn't smoke. So huge
Oh, it's this
mortality difference.
Lindquist study, is it?
Yeah, the Lindquist study. And of course, by the way, that study was repeated by Richard Weller just last year, UK Biobank, 10 times the number of subjects, both men and women, exactly the same findings, no increased statistical significant increase in melanoma incidence or mortality. So there's that data, but then there's also the data that we get right next door in Finland. So multiple studies where everybody saunas, your control group is the one guy that does it once a week. Everybody else does it twice, 3, 4 times, 7 times a week. And so you can see a dose response curve. Rhonda Patrick's talked about this quite a bit on her channel and gone over the data. So, it's an association, so you can't really say causation. However, Bradford Hill criteria clearly states that if you see a dose response curve, then it does imply that there is some causation there, right? So someone who does it 3, 4, 5 times a week is going to get a better reduction in all-cause mortality than the guy who just does it once a week, who's probably still getting a benefit, but you've got to compare it to somebody. I mean, let's face it, if they were to, at one point in Finland, tell everybody to go into their sauna at the same time, there would be enough room in Finland for everybody to go into a sauna. That's how many saunas there are in Finland. It's
Like
crazy.
the Swiss build bunkers and the Finns build saunas, and
Yeah.
each country on their own.
Yeah,
And
no, it's
what about cold exposure? Going to the sauna usually also involves to really cool down directly afterwards. Then more and more people like doing ice baths. And we had like the solar athlete on our podcast quite recently. He was talking about the the massive benefits of cold exposure, especially in winter when you get less sunlight? Do you have any insights on that?
I don't. I've been looking into that because I do believe my hypothesis is that this is what anthropologically those cultures and societies, let's face it, right? Let's back up here. If we were to go back in time far enough to see where, human civilizations began, they began near the equator, and they probably had very dark skin. And as those cultures and societies moved away from the equator, sunlight was such a important factor in human life that they adapted by reducing the amount of melanin so that sunlight could come in even better at higher latitudes. And this is the reason why people, generally speaking, at higher latitudes have lighter skin than people at the equator. So, but did that completely fully compensate for that lack of sunlight? It may have, it may not have. They may have, through society, figured out, because they were susceptible to infections, that when people went into hot saunas and did these things, that they actually did better. And I agree with you. I think the very thing that you're showing here is that it's the high latitude societies that have adapted in their culture the use of sauna. And so I have to believe that there's got to be something there. We know from epidemiological studies that that's the case. We know from physiological studies that it's an exercise equivalent, and that reduces all-cause mortality and things of that nature. So I agree. The studies, by the way, for those of you who are listening to this and say, I want to do that, the studies show that really you need to be above, I'll put it in terms of Fahrenheit. I don't know what it is in Celsius, but in Fahrenheit, it's got to be 174 degrees for at least 20 minutes to really show a benefit. And then, as you said, Georg, cooling down afterwards. And this is another thing. This is amazing. I know that that it's Finnish culture and society to take birch trees and sort of flagellate themselves to try to hit themselves. I don't know if they
Or
knew
each
why they
other?
did that, but I think what it shows is that it's causing better vasoconstriction. It's causing demargination of the white blood cells when you go into a cool environment or a cold environment. But not only does it do that, but when it also vasoconstricts, it's preventing the heat that you have just spent the last 20 minutes building up from coming off of your body as well. And so you lock in that heat. It keeps it up higher, longer. You get a better
Wow.
benefit from it.
So, I mean,
That
the other
makes a lot
thing
of
is
sense.
sort of sauna hats as well, which again, like I mean, I don't know what the science is behind them, but it was in Austria. I was in a sauna, and there was a lady wearing a hat, and I was like, "Well, that looks ridiculous." But then I sort of read more about it, that it's quite, and I guess the science is it locks in the heat as you're describing, in because your head is where a lot of heat is lost from your body, isn't it? So,
It's interesting, when going back to that time 100 years ago in the United States, the largest hospital in the world was the Battle Creek Sanitarium, run by John Harvey Kellogg, who was a big believer in all of these things that he went around the world learning about: sunlight, hydrotherapy. I remember seeing a photograph where there was a long hallway with little holes out of these individual rooms, and there were heads popping out of these holes, and you could see them all the way down the line, and their bodies were in the treatment rooms, and they were being heated up to I don't know what temperature, but exactly.
I was once in such a sauna, like where you're just locked until your neck, and you can stay in them forever. Because I think also the sauna heads, they kind of protect your head from heating up so much, because that's where it gets uncomfortable, and then you need to get out of the sauna. And also, like these saunas where your head is still in the regular temperature, you can stay in them forever, and your body is like sweating and everything, but it's super comfortable because your head is not overheating. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
so the other thing, I mean, we're sort of look, we could talk all day, but I know that you've got a busy day ahead of you. Gail said something which I think is really interesting, which is actually sometimes you just need to be kind to yourself and say, in winter things will change. Like your body is designed to slow down a bit in winter. So rather than kind of getting upset about it, maybe just sort of listen to what your body's telling you a bit more and go to bed earlier, or slump in front of a fire, or just be a bit more kind of relaxed about the whole thing. And it was listening to your stuff around New Start when you went on the Huberman show, and that got me thinking about so many things. So thank you so much, because it's made such a difference to me. But one of the things I felt was that actually, you were telling me things that if I was honest with myself, I knew I just had not listened to myself enough. So I just wondered if you've got any thoughts around being kind to yourself as well around, as we go into winter time, not being too worried if you do feel a bit down.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's one point that is not lost on me as a sleep physician. Many times in patients that come to see me for insomnia, they are very the term that we use is psychophysiological insomnia. And simply this is that the anxiety of not being able to sleep is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so if you are anxious about the fact that something is happening, that's not good for your body either. And it's adding an undue burden. And so there comes a point in time where you say, I've done everything that I can do, and I just need to be happy with what the results are and just be satisfied, because any further worrying about something that you can't change is not really gonna help the situation.
That's really interesting. Well, listen, thank you so much. I mean, as it happens, I'm heading off to the Middle East tomorrow, where it's basically permanent winter for them because they're all inside the whole time because of the heat and things. So, and I think they've got an epidemic of vitamin D deficiencies and so one of the things I'll be talking to people in the Middle East about is actually you need to readdress the balance that you've got with the sun, and I think that's very difficult where, you know, the temperature in Dubai tomorrow is 40 degrees. It's almost impossible to go out at 40 degrees. But, so it's kind of interesting that all of these things around physiology, winter is something that we've got to kind of face, but I think is very doable. You know, the Middle East, they've got to face it as well, but they've got to come up with different solutions. So
Yeah, in the Middle East, I would say that is they're very susceptible to technological advances because it's so much more comfortable going into an air-conditioned building for the whole day, every day, when it's 40 degrees outside for months on end. Yep.
yeah, well, I'll be taking a few incandescent bulbs to give to people as presents. So I don't know
Yeah,
whether you can get them in Dubai or not, but it's very interesting. But listen, I
before we wrap this up, Dave, can I just ask two final questions? Because it's really hard to get Roger on a call, and I think it's really
Please.
it's quite the honor. So thank you, Roger. But like maybe quickly recapping what we talked about vitamin D. So I have two questions. The first one is I have heard a few times already that vitamin D it's only one artifact of UV sun exposure. So if people just think they can replace sun exposure solely by vitamin D, do you have any information on what else UV creates in the body? Are there any hints already, or is it still in research?
Yes. So if I didn't know, I would say it would be a bad assumption to just say that it only does one thing. Again, this is our medical reductionism that says, since I know something, then that must be the only thing because things must be simple. No, things are very complex. There are likely many things. I think in the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the way that the light interacts with our pituitary gland and the pineal gland and all of those, that there's more to life than just vitamin D from the sun. Absolutely.
Thank you. And the other question, which also comes up all the time, I myself had skin cancer like 13 years ago, melanoma, and I'm not using sunscreen anymore. I'm out in the sun as much as I can, and I'm not afraid anymore. But still, like that's the common belief that the sun is dangerous. You get skin cancer if you're exposing yourself. But then, what I've heard in the past a few times already is that all the studies concerning skin cancer have been done with artificial UV lamps without any infrared aspect. And I think you've mentioned it before. So I think the infrared aspect is crucial when you have UV exposure. And can you confirm, like, because it would be really, really interesting to finally, like, really clarify that there have not been real skin cancer studies happening with actual sunlight.
Yes. So my understanding, so let me point to some of the data. Richard Weller, who's a dermatologist, University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and actually will be coming up very shortly and giving a lecture in England. You may want to give
tomorrow
a
as it
link to as
happens
well.
tomorrow. I think on Wednesdays.
Yes, yeah. So by the time this podcast comes out, it probably will already be out. And he's did a study, UK Biobank, I think it was 300,000, 400,000 subjects, looking at solar radiation data, solariums, and over, I think, 12 and a half years, if I'm not mistaken. And what he showed was that even in people who got the highest sun exposure, the very same people that had the lowest mortality in that study, that there was no statistical significant increase in melanoma. And there was certainly the confidence intervals were very wide on the mortality, meaning that there was absolutely no trend at all in terms of what was going on with mortality from melanoma. What I
Mhm.
have heard from dermatologists is this, is that the deadly type of melanoma usually appears on the skin that is not exposed to the sun. That's the first thing I've heard. The second thing I've heard is that when you look at what determines mortality, what are the risk factors for mortality or for improvement or survival in melanoma, it's very counterintuitive. So solar elastosis, which is basically skin damage, sun damage, that is actually predictive of a better outcome with melanoma than if you don't have that. So in other words, it seems as though melanoma may be being caused by other factors. That sunburn may be one of those factors, so we want to avoid sunburning, of course, but that sun exposure is actually a mitigating factor, a reducing factor on melanoma and its properties based on some of the risk factors we're seeing. Look, I'm not here to say anything definitive. I am not a dermatologist,
Mhm.
but I think the one that would be able to answer that question precisely and probably with much more data is Richard Weller. And there is actually a review that he did that was published in a dermatological journal, actually a very prestigious one, the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. And it's titled Sunlight, Time for a Rethink, where he actually goes over the data of sunlight exposure, and its risk-benefit ratio between the fact that we see such clear benefits from all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, non-skin cancer mortality, and on the other hand, we see maybe I mean, maybe we see it, maybe we don't, about melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancers on the other side. So all that to say is that he believes, and I believe societies, and he shows this, are coming around to this thinking that we really shouldn't be having blanket statements for everybody about whether they should be in the sun or not in the sun. It should
Yeah.
be individualized based on skin type, skin color, history of melanoma, history of skin cancer, and a number of various things to really optimize it. Because if we tell people to avoid the sun at all costs, it is coming with a cost. It really is coming at a cost. And so the answer to that, I think, is going to be more nuanced.
No,
Nice. Thank
fascinating.
you.
We will, as you say, I think Richard Weller's talk is in a couple of days' time. By the time this podcast comes out, we should have the published version, because I think the Guy Foundation very kindly are publishing all of the videos on YouTube. So we'll put a link into that. But I think it's a fascinating topic. Well, listen, Roger, thank you so much. I sort of walk away from this, with like my plan for winter, which is actually to spend a lot more time outside, actually look forward to cloudy days rather than, worrying about whether it's going to be sunny or not. Um, think about supplementation, definitely get into the sauna because I love a sauna, so I don't need an excuse. I'm going to try a bit of cold, so I actually did a plunge on Saturday and, found that quite good, and then went for a swim in the lake, and the lake was like 13 degrees. So that was pretty cold.
How many
Um,
kilometers, Dave?
I was only 1.5 kilometers, and then, but I'm feeling a lot better about winter already. So thank you so much for
Yeah, and I would say for those people that go to work and they don't get to see the sun before they go to work or after they go to work, try taking that break outside at the very least.
no, I think that's very, very good advice. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.